if you speak to anyone who's part of, say, the cultural elite, political elite, whether it's people working in the professional managerial class, there's a lot of talk about sustainable food systems and that we need to be able to deal with either a growing population and that we need to be able to feed everyone. Things need to be more equitable. It's all part of a just transition. And there is a lot of focus on processed foods, I suppose. And there are various institutions, but they could be non-governmental organizations, they could be part of supranational institutions that are all focused on coming up with some kind of a sustainable food system. What's your take on that? And I suppose as a follow-up, why should we care where our food is from and what we eat?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So yeah, I mean, there's a global push really for more sustainable food systems, for more equitable food systems. And actually that's basically the focus of my last book. So I've got a new book coming out. Actually, I think next month it's coming out, called The Last Men, Liberalism and the Death of Masculinity. That's about the political implications of testosterone decline. It's kind of following on actually from the Tucker Carlson documentary that I was in. So it's it's continuing the themes. It's looking at the causes of testosterone decline, but also the political implications and trying to situate testosterone decline actually within kind of late liberalism, liberal democracy, and particularly Francis Fukuyama's end of history thesis. It's kind of deeply philosophical, actually. I think people will be surprised. It's not. It will ruffle a few feathers, I think, and it's interesting. It'll get people thinking. But my previous book before that was called The Eggs Benedict Option, which is a riff on the Benedict Option, which was a book written by Rod Dreher 5 or 6 years ago, maybe. 2017, actually, I think that was written. But anyway, so that book is about this idea of a plant-based future, that what we need to do in order to save the planet, not only from climate change, but also from overpopulation or from massively expanding global population, because the projection is, well, by 2050, there are going to be 10 billion people on the planet. They all need to be fed. They need to be fed healthily. So what do we do? Well, we move away from traditional animal agriculture and we turn over farmland to arable, to crop raising, and we employ all sorts of new techniques. We use new genetically modified strains of like wheat and soy and legumes and all these kinds of things. And advanced techniques as well, AI and drones and all sorts of stuff like that, and laser weeders and all this kind of stuff to maximize yield so that we can, A, reduce carbon emissions as much as possible, and B, produce enough plant food to feed 10 billion people in an equitable, sustainable manner. So, I mean, this is a big push that is taking place. It's taking place across the globe. It has the backing of the UN, scientific establishment, the medical establishment, NGOs, celebrities and philanthropists, captains of industry, activist groups. I mean, it's like this is massive global push. And my book is basically, an argument against it. It's an argument against a plant-based future for a number of reasons. Health reasons, for a start, because plant-based diets are maladaptive, and I draw very heavily on the work of a pioneering dentist, anthropologist called Weston Price. He wrote a book in the 1930s called Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, which is an amazing book. I actually think it's the best book on nutrition that has ever been written. So Weston Price was a dentist in Canada, he was Canadian rather, but he was a dentist in the US, in Cleveland, in Ohio. And he was a dentist sort of around about the turn of the 20th century. And he noticed increasingly that his patients, and particularly the children, were coming to him with, basically physical degeneration. So it's in the title of the book. He noticed that not only were their mouths full of cavities, but actually their faces weren't developing properly, their jaws weren't developing properly, the dental arch, the roof of the mouth wasn't developing properly, the airways and the cheeks and the whole face was almost the structure was collapsing basically. And so he intuited, he understood, of course, this is something to do with what people are eating. And what was happening at the turn of the 20th century was that actually Americans, really for the first time on a widespread scale, were starting to eat industrially produced foodstuffs, so foods produced in factories, rather than whole foods, locally produced, locally prepared, which is what people have eaten for the entire span of human history up until the 20th century. So there was a profound dietary transformation taking place in the US. It was also taking place in other countries, in Britain and other parts of the industrialized world. But you can think of the kinds of foods that they were starting to eat as processed foods, the first processed foods. So like refined wheat products, canned goods, things like that, sugar syrups, foods produced in factories. The forerunners of the kind of ultra-processed foods that we've been eating since the 50s, and particularly the 1980s and 1990s. And so Weston A. Price was like, okay, I think it's the food. He was a scientifically minded man. So he said, what we need some control groups to compare. Yeah. So he decided to go on this kind of globe-trotting adventure, visiting traditional societies, small-scale societies, where they ate their traditional diets, where they ate the kind of foods that their ancestors had been eating. So he went to Arctic Canada, and he saw the Inuit, who were eating salmon and caribou and elk and all that kind of stuff. He went to Africa, and he met pastoralists who were consuming their traditional diet of blood, meat, and milk. He went to the Highlands and Islands of Scotland and stayed with crofters. He went to high alpine Switzerland and visited remote communities there, where they still basically subsisted on a diet of rye bread, butter, little bit of meat, milk, and alpine trout. Like very simple, very basic diet of whole foods. He went to Africa. He went to Australia and Polynesia, Fiji, New Zealand, South Pacific, Solomon Islands, places like that. And he basically came to the conclusion that, or what he saw basically was that traditional societies, where they still eat their traditional diets, that are based in nutrient-dense animal foods in particular. So that's things like organ meat, fatty cuts of meat, eggs, dairy, seafood, especially in places like New Zealand and the South Pacific. None of these signs of physical degeneration that he saw back in Cleveland among his patients were visible at all. And in fact, so, and he took lots of pictures as well, which is a great part of the book. He has these pictures that show you, what a Western diet does to the structure of a person's face, or what an emerging Western industrialized diet does to a person's face. But what he also saw actually as well in these traditional societies and on the fringes of these traditional societies was the encroachment of, or the infiltration of, Western foods, these canned foods, refined goods. And wherever traditional societies moved away from their ancestral diet towards a Western processed diet, they also started to display exactly the same signs of physical degeneration as the people back in the US. So he established a very, very compelling empirical case that basically the best way to maintain optimum health is to consume an ancestral diet built around nutrient-dense animal foods primarily. So that's a long, explanation of basically my standpoint on diet, which is like an ancestral standpoint on diet. And it's very clear that a plant-based diet is incompatible with what Weston Price calls perfect health. I have a nutritional beef, if you will, with these plant-based diets and this plant-based agenda. But there's also a social and political aspect to it as well. And so in the Eggs Benedict option, then I actually compare the plant-based revolution that's supposed to be taking place, which is often called the Great Reset. It's part of the Great Reset. I mean, that's a pretty difficult term, and it conjures up all sorts of kind of conspiracy theories or accusations of conspiracy theories. But I mean, there's no doubt that that this kind of plant-based transformation is being planned and is being advocated, and there are policy documents about it, etc. And I look at the policy documents. I'm not just plucking this stuff out of thin air. I'm actually looking at specific, policy documents that have been written and nutritional guidelines, etc. But there's a political and a social element to it as well, and I compare the Great Reset plan for a plant-based diet to the agricultural revolution that took place in the Near East about 10 to 12,000 years ago, and I say, look, that was a profound social and political transformation that was built off the back of a total transformation of the way that food was produced and consumed. So, the agricultural revolution was the move away from hunter-gatherer lifestyles to the first states supported by fixed field farming, basically. So that's like the domestication of wild crops, cereal crops, and also the domestication of a handful of animals, and the emergence of the first urban settlements, these great agglomerations of people in numbers that had never been seen before. So hunter-gatherers would, you'd have a maximum maybe 150 people in the hunter-gatherer group, right? That was about as big as it could get. Well, these first cities in Mesopotamia, then you have 50,000 people. I mean, it's a total social and political transformation, and you have states and armies and bureaucracies. And all of that is off the back of the transition to agriculture as we understand it. So I make this kind of provocative comparison, and I say, look, control of the food supply is a political issue. We don't think it is. We've forgotten. So there's this great quotation from Ernst Junger, and he says, long periods of peace and stability favor certain optical illusions. And he's talking, I think it's from the Forest Passage, which is one of his books, but he says he's talking particularly about like the security of the household. And he says, the security of the household doesn't rest on the state. Fundamentally, it rests on the willingness of the father, the head of the household, to appear on the threshold of his dwelling with his axe, with his sons. Like that's the basis of security, is the individual will to defend oneself. Well, another optical illusion that is, I think, favored by periods of peace and stability is this notion that actually it doesn't matter who controls the food supply. The food is just there, food is just there. It doesn't matter who supplies it. Well, actually it does. It really does. And that's what we're seeing with this plant-based agenda, that actually you're getting corporations controlling the food supply to an ever greater extent. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we eat so much processed food, is because corporations have captured the food supply in a way that, is without any kind of parallel in human history. That's one of the main developments of the 20th century, is corporate capture of the food supply and the replacement of locally produced, simply produced foods with these kind of novel fabrications that require factories and all sorts of novel ingredients, stabilizers, texturizers, preservatives, etc., colorings, to produce. You have to have a factory, and you have to be a corporation to be able to produce these foods. Well, actually, now they're more and more of our diet. I mean, I think toddlers in the UK, aged 2 to 5, get something like 66% of their daily calories from ultra processed food now. So there's been this transfer of ownership of the food supply into the hands of corporations. And that's only going to advance with this plant-based agenda. And I mean, it's quite explicitly set out. In order to feed 10 billion people, all crops need to be genetically modified. Well, corporations own genetically modified cereals and other crops, right? You patent them. I mean, that's why they like them, right? So if you're a farmer and you buy genetically modified seeds from Monsanto or Bayer, who now own Monsanto, you have to sign a contract. And that contract says things like, for example, you can't give the seeds to anybody else. At the end of the year, you have to discard the seeds that you haven't used. You have to come back to Monsanto next year to buy more. There are all sorts of these crazy conditions attached to the use of genetically modified crops because they are actually patented and owned by the the corporations that manufacture them. Unlike normal wheat seed, So it's it's kind of a the eggs Benedict option is so it's like a kind of dual kind of rebuttal of this plant-based agenda on nutritional grounds, because it's not good for us, because it's maladaptive, because we should be eating animal-based products, we should be building our diets around animal foods, and also then from the political side, because actually what it means is that we're surrendering basically total control of the food supply to corporations backed by governments. And that's not a good thing. It's made us massively unhealthy through the 20th century because, we've had all these processed foods foisted on us. And what it will mean essentially is that actually you will not be able to get a hold of animal foods, even if you want to. And so, there's you often hear people saying, well, they're going to ban meat, they're going to ban milk, ban eggs. And I talk about that in the book, and I say, look, I don't actually think that that's what they'll do. I don't think that that's the way that it will work. What I think is that actually you'll see what's happening in the UK at the moment, and this is very interesting with the new inheritance tax laws for farmers. What you're going to see is increasing corporate control of the actual farmland. So, family farms are going to be broken up because farmers can't afford to pay inheritance tax. And so they'll be gobbled up. They won't go to, the Labour government is saying, look, what will happen is this will break the monopoly of larger farmers, on the market for agricultural land. And it will let, young people into the farming business, and they can get a little parcel of land and have a little farm and a family. It's not going to work like that. It's going to be big corporations and asset funds that gobble up all the land. And then, instead of having a class of owner farmers, you're going to have a class of renter farmers who are all renting their land from corporations. But what will happen as well is you'll get corporations owning farmland, and then they'll turn it over for different purposes, or they'll just stop using it for animal agriculture. So you're seeing these huge, great solar farms turning up all across the English countryside. Where I live, then you drive through the countryside. Oh, there's another 5 fields full of solar panels that have gone up. And what that will do, of course, is that will create artificial scarcity, and that will drive up the prices because you've got less farmland being used for animal agriculture, which drives up the prices. And so it's a kind of it's quite insidious. It's quite insidious. There may very well also be things like carbon taxes as well. That's something that I talk about, and that's something that's been mooted. You put extra taxes on products that are most polluting, that release the most carbon. And so, right, what's that? Well, it's beef. So if you want to have a steak, then you're going to have to pay a surcharge to have a piece of steak. What they will do is they'll price people out of eating animal foods regularly. So it's a sinister thing, and it doesn't work by any kind of logic of consumer choice. It's not democratic. People have voted already with their pounds and their dollars and their euros. Nobody wants to buy plant-based meat, for example. So you've got these big companies like Beyond and Impossible, billions of dollars behind them, massive propaganda pushes all the time. This is healthier, and it tastes as good as normal animal meat, normal ground beef. People don't believe it. People don't buy the products. Billions of dollars are wasted. The share price collapses. They fire thousands of people, and yet still somehow these companies sort of persist because they're propped up. Because actually, I think investors are looking forward to a time when there will be explicit government support for them, where there'll be subsidies perhaps, and it might actually be the case that people just can't afford to eat normal animal products, and so they say, okay, what the hell, I'll have a plant-based beef burger because I want to have something like a beef burger. So it's a complicated thing. I make the argument as well in the book that, look, I don't honestly know that you can you certainly can't make a case that will convince me that I should give up animal products, the products that are necessary for my health, simply because there are going to be 5 billion people in Africa. Like that's you're going to have to try harder to convince me that that is something that I have to do. But that is, it's just the assumption is, oh well, there's going to be 10 billion people in the world, so we've all of us in the West, because of course it is us in the West, are going to have to give up animal foods. And yeah, I mean, it doesn't follow for me. So I mean, it's a complicated. It's a book. I mean, it's a 300 odd page book. I mean, it's a kind of, I consider it to be like a distillation of all of and a formulation actually of all of the kind of doctrines of raw egg nationalism and all of the kind of ideas that I'm trying to promote about the relationship between health and fitness and diet and politics on the other hand. And it's been very successful actually. It's been very, very well received. It was top of the Amazon chart in its category for almost a year. I mean, it beat off books by like George Monbiot, for example. He had a book called Regenesis that was actually an argument that was the opposite argument. So his argument was for a plant-based future, and then mine is for the returning to the past. But yeah, I beat his book off, and yeah, it's been a big success.